It's important when you're making an argument that you're speaking the truth. Obviously, we care about making true statements. But as we saw in the last video, it's also important that the words are arranged properly so that the argument is valid, we say, so that it flows logically. So you want to be careful that you bring truth and validity together to make really the best arguments. And I just want to give you a couple examples here. What if I were to say something that is true, but admittedly not in the best way? Right? Let me give you an example here. Maybe somebody comes up and says, that Satan, Satan, he's bad. Satan's bad because he's not good, and you don't want no part of somebody that's bad. Well, okay, I think we could agree that that's all true, right? We know that Satan is evil, and you don't want any piece of that. But do you think that the way I just said that would convince anybody? I don't think so, right? The logic was not clear, it's repetitious, and quite frankly, the grammar wasn't even good. Now, what if I said something in a good, clear way that was false? Consider this. Based on the DNA evidence, it is obvious that the person called Jesus Christ could not have raised from the dead. Well, that sounds very nice. I said it in an authoritative tone. My grammar was fine. But it's not true. We know that Jesus did arise from the grave. So you want to make sure that what you're saying is true and is being said in the best possible way, in a way that's valid and therefore is persuasive. So here comes Kangaroo, and she says, let's get started with some terminology. Validity is a characteristic of a syllogism in which the conclusion follows logically from the premises. And we started talking about validity in the last video. And then Logic Dragon comes in and he says, validity is all about the form of the argument, but truth is about accuracy. And he defines truth this way, as a characteristic of a syllogism in which the premises and conclusion are factually accurate and correct. And I like what he says there. It really helps you make the distinction. Validity is about form. Truth is about accuracy. And then Socrates pops back and he says, when you combine validity and truth, you get soundness. Soundness is a characteristic of the syllogism, in which the syllogism is both valid and true. And ultimately, that is what is the most important thing. You want to make sound arguments. Arguments where the premises and conclusion are all true and the structure is valid. Now we've got this picture of me as a Roman centurion, and the centurion is saying all Romans were vegetarians, all soldiers in Legion 10 were Romans, therefore all soldiers in Legion 10 were vegetarians. And the kid in the audience is thinking, I guess that's right, this guy seems to know what he's talking about. But then the blue fellow says, not so fast. His argument is valid because its schema is AAA1. Okay? And you may want to back that video up and look at that argument. All right? All Romans were vegetarians. All soldiers in Legion 10 were Romans. All soldiers in Legion 10 were vegetarians. That's a AAA1. That is indeed valid. He says, but it isn't sound. And the girl in gold says, that's right. Not all Romans were vegetarians. Even though the form of his argument is valid, the argument itself is not sound because one of the premises is not true. Now let's try another one. So here's this scientist saying all squares are rectangles, no triangles are squares, therefore all rectangles are triangles. Logic Dragon says, that sounds right, but I'm not sure. that guy is no Einstein. And of course, that obviously is Einstein, as the fellow in green says, yeah, actually that guy is Einstein. But Logic Dragon is correct. Something seems a bit off in that syllogism. And the fellow in black says, all the premises were true, but the AEE1 schema is not valid. So the argument is not sound. Now, more often than not, people build their arguments on premises that are true, or at least I like to think that they do. Right? I'd like to think that most people don't start off their argument with lying. The bigger challenge really is going to lie with validity. Okay, so in making sure we've got a sound argument, I think most people start off with something that's true, but where they get a little mixed up is in the validity. And there are several ways to test the validity of an argument, and one way is called the counterexample. The counterexample is a technique used to demonstrate that a seemingly valid syllogism is actually invalid. And we're going to walk you through an example of that here. But Socrates explains it like this. He says, look, if both premises in a syllogism are true, but the conclusion is false, then you know that the syllogism is invalid. Now, if you suspect this is the case with a certain syllogism, he says try a counterexample in which you construct a new syllogism with the same schema, but with a conclusion you know is false. If you can, then the original syllogism is invalid. So if you've got a syllogism and you're not 100% sure about it, try to come up with another one that's the same schema, right? Has the same mood and figure, leading to a conclusion you know is false. And if you can do that, then you know that the original syllogism would have to be invalid. So, fellow in black, he says, let's give this a try. All dogs are canines, and all Labradors are canines. Therefore, all Labradors are dogs. And the girl in gold says, well, that does seem to make sense, and what you say is certainly true. But I need to check to see if your argument is also valid and therefore sound. So she says, what if we said all pens are items filled with ink and all inkwells are items filled with ink? We would conclude that all inkwells are pens. Uh-oh. We've obviously got a problem here. And Logic Dragon points it out. He says, clearly, inkwells are not fountain pens, which means that the guy's syllogism about dogs, while true, was not valid and therefore wasn't sound. Right? It seemed just fine, but when she ran a parallel example using the exact same form or schema of syllogism, and it led to an obviously false conclusion, then we know that the original syllogism was not valid. Kangaroo's thinking, wow, those are some handsome writing instruments, though. And just a little side note, those are a couple of my fountain pens. I love fountain pens. I actually have a fountain pen collection, so those are really neat writing instruments. Now, in the last video, we gave you the chart of the valid forms of syllogisms, the 15 valid forms, and that's one way to check to see if a syllogism is valid. Just simply look at its schema and say, hey, is it on the list? Another way is the counterexample, which we just saw. And there are some additional ways to evaluate validity. And I want to walk you through those because this validity thing is so important. Because if we get it wrong, then that means our argument is not sound and really won't be as persuasive as it could be. So here we go. Here's another one of my charts. And it turns out there are 7 rules that syllogisms have to follow. And if if a syllogism breaks even one of these, then we know that that syllogism is invalid. So I want to talk about these a little bit, but you are certainly going to want to copy these into your notes. Rule number 1 says there are only 3 terms in a syllogism, right? The major, the minor, and the middle. And if you've got more than that, that's called the fallacy of 4 terms. Also, the middle term cannot be in the conclusion. Obviously enough, that's the fallacy of middle term in conclusion. And then these others we're going to be talking about in the next video, so I'm not going to go into great detail on those. but 3 through 7, go ahead and copy those. So you get the chart into your notes. And again, you might want to pause the video while you do that. And when you're done, we'll continue. So here's a little blue kangaroo. And blue kangaroo says all kangaroos are marsupials. And since all koala bears are also from Australia, that means all koala bears are marsupials. And yellow kangaroo says, something's not right, Blue Roo. She says koalas are marsupials, just like us. But I don't think your reasoning is valid. So let's kind of highlight what Blue Roo said. And we see we've got, 4 terms, right? Kangaroos, marsupials, koala bears, and the phrase animals from Australia. She says you have 4 terms in your syllogism, but you can have only 3, right? So Blue Roo has committed the fallacy of having 4 terms. And then Green Roo says, I understand. How about this? All people who steal are criminals. And since all baseball players are people who steal bases, all baseball players are criminals. And Original Kangaroo says, actually, you still have 4 terms, since you have used the idea of stealing in 2 different ways. Stealing money and stealing a base are not the same things. So even though that kind of seemed like Green Roo had the right number of terms, actually that wasn't the case. And that leads us to an important term here called equivocation. Equivocation occurs when a syllogism appears to contain only 3 terms, but actually contains 4, because one of the terms is used in 2 different ways. And I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't point out that equivocation comes from 2 Latin words, aequus, meaning equal, and vocare, meaning to call. So it's like you're calling 2 words equal when really they're not. They're being used in different ways. Logic Dragon comes back and he's talking to Socrates. He says, I don't know what you've got against dragons, buddy. We know our logic. All old philosophers are know-it-alls. Besides, all old philosophers are rude. Conclusion, all old philosophers are just rude. Socrates is thinking, doesn't he know he just used the middle term in the conclusion? His syllogism is invalid. And that's the second one of our rules. You can't have the middle term in the conclusion. If you do, you really have not said something that is valid. Now you may be thinking, come on, those mistakes are not likely to happen, especially that one about the middle term in the conclusion. Right? You can see that one from a mile away. And I agree, those are things that we probably aren't going to make in writing. But I got to tell you the truth. When people are speaking, just in the heat of the moment, or speaking in front of people, it's very easy to make mistakes. And I would caution you, if you see somebody making a mistake logically, especially somebody who's speaking, be careful before you just come down on them like a ton of bricks. Now, I'm not saying that you let it go. You might point out, but politely, that there is something wrong with maybe the validity of what they have said. But realize those kinds of mistakes can happen to all of us. They certainly happen to me and any teacher, I think, when you're speaking publicly. That's very, very easy to do. Next time, we'll talk about more ways to evaluate validity.